Bom dia, pessoal. Tudo bem? Vamos começar primeiro com um vídeo
Good morning,
institucional do
everyone.
NIC.
Let's start off with one of our celebratory videos for Nick. Imagine if you don't have your freedom of speech right respected, if your private data were disclosed without your authorization, or if your navigation was filtered because of commercial interests. So freedom of speech, privacy, and neutrality of the network are essential for the internet, and those are just some of the 10 principles that were created by the CGI.br, who promotes the internet for over 20 years in the country. Thanks to it, you have constant innovation, security, and guidelines to develop the internet. All of that is done in a collaborative manner with transparency and democracy. The committee is comprised by representatives of all sectors of society, so the decisions are made through dialogue with the participation of all members until consensus is reached. For these and other factors, the Brazilian model of governance is the benchmark for the world. CGI.br for an internet even better in Brazil. When you register a .br domain, you're contributing towards the improvement of the internet in Brazil. Each domain that uses .br is registered by NIC.br, the nucleus of information and coordination of .br. In addition to registering the domains, it invests in analysis and treatment of security incidents, projects for technology and operations, research for indicators for the use of technology, information technology and data, implementation of changing data on the web, and projects that contribute towards the global development of the web, and much more. All of that because NIC.br is a private civil entity that's not for profit, that maintains a secure, stable, and confident domain, and reverts part of what you pay for your domain into the development of infrastructure, providing benefits for everyone that uses the internet in Brazil. All of that innovation, state-of-the-art technology, security, and infrastructure is only possible because you have a .br domain, NIC.br, always pursuing the best for our internet.
Bom, pessoal, sejam muito bem-vindas e muito
Welcome
bem-vindos ao último dia
to
do
the
16º
last day
Seminário de
of the
Proteção à
16th
Privacidade e aos Dados
seminar for
Pessoais.
the
Essa
protection
edição em que
of privacy and
comemoramos os
personal
15
data.
anos
In
do
this edition,
seminário,
we're
desde a
celebrating
criação
the
do evento.
15-year
Meu nome é
anniversary of the
Loriane
creation of the
Mahi-Shippers,
event.
eu faço
I'm
parte da equipe de
Loriane
assessoria
Mahi-Shippers.
da
I'm part of the
CGI.br
advisory
e
committee of
também da organização do
CGI.br
16º
and the
Seminário.
organization
Eu
of the
gostaria
16th
desde já de
seminar.
agradecer o
So, to
engajamento, a
start, I would like to
audiência e a
thank
presença de
for the
todo mundo
engagement
nesses
and
últimos 2 dias de
presence of
debates
everyone in the
intensos e de
past 2
celebração.
days of intense debate and
Lembrando que este
celebration.
evento é uma
I'd like to
realização do
remind you
Comitê
that
Gestor da
this event is
Internet no
brought to
Brasil
you
e do
by the
Núcleo de
CGI
Informação
in
e
Brazil
Coordenação do
and
PGBR, em
the
parceria com o Ministério
NIC.br in
Público Federal,
partnership
a
with
FGV Direito
the
São
Federal
Paulo e o
Prosecutor's
capítulo
Office,
Brasil da Internet
FGV São
Society.
Paulo School of
Agradecemos
Law
também o apoio da
and
Autoridade
Society
Nacional de
of
Proteção de
Law
Dados, o
chapter. We'd
IPREC,
also like to
ALANA,
thank the
artigo
IPREC
19,
Alana, Article
Associação Brasileira
19,
de
the
Propriedade
Brazilian
Intelectual e
Association
Data
of Intellectual Property
Privacy Brasil.
and Data
Antes de
Privacy
iniciar
Brazil.
formalmente nossas
Before we
atividades,
formally
alguns avisos
begin the
protocolais.
event, we have some
Seguimos com a transmissão ao
housekeeping
vivo
rules.
no
We,
canal do
we
NIC.br no
have
YouTube. E também temos
the
a
live
tradução
streaming on
simultânea das atividades que
NIC.br
estão
and YouTube, and we
acontecendo
also
nesse
offer
salão
simultaneous
principal. Hoje,
translation
nossa
in the
Keynote
plenary
fará sua
session.
apresentação
Our
em
keynote will
inglês
give her
e, aos
presentation in
presentes, é
English,
possível
and
ligar
to
o seu aparelho
everyone
de
present,
tradução
you can get
simultânea ao
a
lado do credenciamento.
simultaneous
As
translation
perguntas ao
headset
longo da
outside.
programação de hoje
The
poderão ser
questions
enviadas por meio de um formulário acessível
that will
por
be
QR
made
Code,
today
que
can be
será mostrado
submitted
na
by a
tela, e
QR
o link
code
para
that
realizar as
will be shown
perguntas
on the
também
screen,
será
and the link
compartilhado no
for
chat
the
do YouTube.
questions will also
Por meio
be
do QR Code, é
on
possível
YouTube.
marcar uma
With the
opção
QR
caso
code, you can mark
deseje
the
ser
option
chamados
if
ao
you wish to
microfone
be
para
called to
ler
a
sua
microphone
pergunta. Nos painéis
to
com
ask your
microfone
question.
livre, as perguntas podem
In the
ser
panels
feitas
with a free
também pelo
microphone,
chat
you
do
can
YouTube.
also ask the questions
Recomendamos, por
in
fim,
the
que não
chat on
deixem itens de
YouTube.
valor na sala,
Do not leave your
especialmente nos
belongings
intervalos
in the
mais
room,
longos de
especially
cafés e
during
de
the
almoço.
longer breaks.
Hoje, a nossa programação se mantém na temática
Today,
de
Our program is still about privacy and protection of personal data, but now we're bridging towards tomorrow's event, the second seminar of the Brazilian Observatory for AI. If you wish, you can join. We'll start off the second day with Keynote, Data Justice and Emerging Technologies Implication based on data science with Renée Cummings. After lunch, we'll have the panel Regulatory Sandbox and AI. Afterwards, the personal data protection in Gen AI. And last, we'll have our closing ceremony. We'll continue with the celebratory videos for the 15th anniversary of the event now.
A gente percebe que com o desenvolvimento de tecnologias, como por exemplo,
see that with the development of technologies such as AI, there's a huge debate and concern regarding the protection of privacy and personal data. We still don't know the regulatory path that will be taken in our country regarding AI, for instance. So we currently have a bill that's in Congress that handles AI regulations, that addresses principles that are very similar to the principles that are part of the Brazilian data privacy law, the LGPD. But there's also a matter regarding technology that hasn't been well assessed or understood. So the role of the seminar and the upcoming editions of the seminar is to identify how these emerging technologies, and now I'm specifically talking about AI, could somehow either protect the data privacy and personal data, meaning instruments that will allow the development and protect fundamental rights, and also sets the impact and risks that AI could eventually have on these rights. So it's about analyzing how that balance can be reached. So the seminar plays that very important role of investigating how emerging technologies could impact the fundamental rights. It's a way of thinking how human rights can be protected in these technologies. Now we're going to move on to our keynote, Data Justice and Emerging Technologies, Implications Based on Data Science, with Renée Cummings from the University of Virginia. Renée, could you please come up on stage?
Of course, you know, I'm not understanding anything that you're saying. I know. What do you want me to do? Sit, stand?
Também peço para a moderadora do painel,
I'd like to ask the moderator of the panel, Bianca Kramer, a member of CGI.br, join us on stage.
Apenas a título de informe, as perguntas deste painel serão feitas na
For
modalidade
information purposes, the questions will be asked with an open mic when the moderator opens for Q&A. The more complete introductions will be made by our moderator.
A palavra é sua.
Bianca, the floor is yours. Thank you, Lopiani. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to moderate this panel today and having the happiness of being able to count on our keynote with so much expertise as Renée Cummings has, a professor that has been endeavoring many efforts in the past years in criminology, in data justice, with solid contribution, not only in academia, but also in activism and civil society for the positive impacts. So we can think of ethics in AI and considering to avoid the mitigation of biases, discrimination, and consider potential paths for many of the tools that are connected to the use of these new technologies. I'm very happy that the CGI.br can count on a professional like Renée. And I believe that the work and the research that Renée Cummings has been developing in the past years very much match the contemporary problems that we face here in Brazil on many different fronts. Sharing public data, for instance, now with minutes of decrees of the Ministry of Innovation related to the use of public data in the administration, the increase in the use of AI tools, not only for penal activities, but also criminal investigations with new ordinance of the Ministry of Justice that have been brought in for the guidelines in criminal investigations in the Brazilian context, and not only using data, but also using AI technologies in this process. And the aspects about ethics and AI and explainability and collecting and using intelligence in data for decision-making processes, public and private. Today, we are facing a more advanced moment in treating the personal data and enforcing legislation in personal data in Brazilian regulations than the past 5 or 10 days. Since we've had the LGPD, the data privacy law in Brazil, every year we've been maturing our debates. And with the maturity of the debates, we're also facing new challenges. So I believe that the research and the knowledge that Renée Cummings has to offer can really enrich our reflections in the Brazilian context as well, so we can handle different scenarios and technologies that have become increasingly more complex and pervasive, have been in our society. So now I'd like to hand the floor over to our dear Renée Cummings, and thank you once again for the honor for us to count on your presence here, on all your expertise, and truly thank you for listening to you today and you coming back to Brazil as you were here 2 years ago, and you were part of seminars also in Supreme Court, opening up the debate in the Brazilian context. So it's an honor, and we're very proud to have you here once again during this new phase that Brazil is facing now in terms of privacy and protection of personal data and the development and use of systems and tools in AI. So thank you very much, Renée. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Let me say it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to be with you. As Bianca said, this is my second time in Brazil. I was here in 2023. The Supreme Court was looking at questions around algorithmic decision-making and how bias and discrimination were being baked into the algorithms that were being used for judicial decision-making. So this conversation that we are going to have is really a continuation of the questions around data, AI, power, the ways in which we are thinking about the data power structure, the ways in which we are understanding the benefits of data in enterprise, the ways in which we can develop real-time excellence with data, but also an understanding that where data is being used, there are questions of exploitation, questions of erasure, questions of exclusion, and of course, the biggest question, the question of extraction and the question of colonization when it comes to understanding the impact of data. So power, and this is where we're going to begin. Data is now considered the greatest geopolitical game changer globally. Every country, as you know, rightfully so in Brazil, because you have really been leading the way when it comes to understanding questions of data governance and questions of data sovereignty, and much of the ways in which Brazil is thinking about data centers data justice as the nucleus of much of your policy. We know that globally, every country is interested in data. We've heard who owns the data owns the world. Data is now our DNA. Data is now the new oil. Who has the data is going to make the decisions. We also know there is a concentration of data power, now AI power, and we also know that there is no AI without data. When we think about data, and we think about who owns the world's data, we know there is a monopoly around data, and we know that monopoly exists in the global north. The fact that every country, every government, every leader, every CEO, every manager is talking about data speaks to that power. How powerful is data? How did data become this powerful? What is data being used for? Why is our data being extracted and packaged and repackaged and repurposed and sold and traded and stolen? What is it about this thing called data that someone, an organization, an agency, an entity, a group would want access to it? Access that they would actually do something criminal, like stealing that data, like hacking. So I want you to think about data, and I want you to think about it within the context of power. And when we think about data, we're thinking that this thing called data is now creating an invisible war, where individuals, agencies, countries are trying to exploit, trying to extract, trying to get this commodity. And when we think about this data war, it's not happening with boots, it's not happening with tanks, it's not happening with the kind of ammunition that we're accustomed seeing, but it's actually happening with something that is even more powerful than those arsenals that are being used for war. So who owns it? Who owns data owns the world. Who owns data is now governing this very invisible but powerful terrain. Like every empire, data comes cloaked in promise, because we speak about the promise of big data, but we know that promise often leaves behind the weight of loss. Think about it. 2021 in your own country, Brazilians' personal data on sale online, a nation exposed. When we think about data, data is as powerful as it is as vulnerable. So we have something that's so powerful, something that everyone wants, something that is now governing the ways in which we think, we engage, we interact, the ways in which we are thinking about development, the future, how do we co-create, and this very, very powerful thing is also very, very vulnerable. It's open to attack. if it gets in the wrong hands, if it gets in the hands of bad actors, this very powerful thing becomes something that is very deadly. So where there is reward, there is risk. Where there is power, there is peril. And where there is the ability to design an extraordinary future with data, there's also the danger of what data can do. Think about the health ministry, a website being hacked during COVID, and that data being extracted, and that data is being sold. We don't really think about our data. We use technology, and we need data. Data has been really working to help us solve some of the world's greatest challenges. I consider myself a critical data scientist. For the last decade, I've been speaking globally about big data ethics, but I also spend a lot of time with CEOs in the C-suite, with design teams, helping them tweak and create very bespoke models when it comes to using data. We know this powerful thing is vulnerable to bad actors, and we know if we don't have the requisite regulation, the real-time governance, and the enforcement that is required, we know the danger of data. So it is fantastic, but it is also something that we have got to protect. When we're thinking about data, we're also thinking about what data extracts. As a criminologist, criminal psychologist, and a terrorism expert, I spend a lot of time looking at data within the context of policing, law enforcement, national security, defense, the ways in which we are thinking about terrorism attacks. And one of the things we have realized is that data is extracted from very strange places. And many of the times our own engagement with data comes from a place of often fun, often entertainment. We're using our phones. We're surfing the internet. We're engaging with friends on Facebook. We're posting about our fabulous lives on Instagram. We're sharing the things that we are doing professionally on LinkedIn. We are putting up things on TikTok. We are downloading. We are purchasing on Amazon. And we are doing everything that we need to do, and we are sharing our data in ways in which we are not even thinking about. Most people who purchased an Alexa never thought about the fact that an Alexa could be subpoenaed by the courts, could become a part of a police investigation, and could be used against you, as we have seen in several cases in the US when it came to domestic violence and, of course, homicide in the home, that the Alexa was forever on, collecting that data, collecting those voices, and that information being extracted. Now we're talking about brain data. And the fact, when we think about neurology and neuropsychology, we are seeing that the data in our brain, our thoughts, our memories, our processes, how our frontal lobe is making executive decisions, could be data that's extracted, not just for healthcare, but it could be for criminal justice, to see how someone was thinking before they perpetrated a crime. So we have got to think about how data is being extracted. And many individuals using these home DNA tests never envisioned that their data would become part of police data. So when you think about data and you think about how you're using your data, you've got to be very, very strategic. So data is about possibilities. Data is about how do we use this information to make the best public decisions that we can. We know that data is about insight, data is about foresight, data is about insight. When we're thinking about how we use that data, we can get the best information, we can forecast, We could reimagine just about every business model. We can enhance and reimagine, reposition, redefine just about every discipline and every industry. Look at these fantastic photos. Look at what's happening when we think about data in manufacturing and the kinds of advancements that we are seeing when it comes to real-time excellence, when it comes to reimagining and repositioning these business models of excellence that companies are using to profit. When we think about agriculture, and we think about e-agriculture and AI-infused agriculture, we're seeing some great things. But we're also seeing job losses. We're seeing an impact on the labor market. We're seeing women impacted because these jobs that women often have done are now being taken away from them. We know data is about entertainment. When we think about how we can exist in a virtual world, when we think about augmented reality, mixed media, and the kind of excitement we are seeing when it comes to film, and when it comes to the entertainment industry, when it comes to our ability to use a GPT and put in a prompt and come up with a video. Advertising agencies, marketing agencies, anyone dealing in this digital advertising sphere in which we now exist can tell you about the power of data to really ensure the possibilities of a wider, greater experience. But with that possibility comes the concern. The concern where there is excellence in manufacturing, there is also exploitation, where we're seeing something like farming. We're thinking now of questions of erasure, of certain groups no longer having jobs, certain communities unable to fulfill particular legacies. So where there is excellence, there is exploitation, there is extraction, there is exclusion. We need to always think of that balance. So as we move on, I want you to just think about two things here. During COVID, many of the instruments that were being used, particularly in the US, to really measure the levels of oxygen were not tested on diverse data sets. And it was only after COVID, doctors at a particular university in the US, where the oximeter was designed and developed and used, realized that they never tested those instruments in its building phase on black and brown skin. And what it was really doing was giving an inaccurate reading that led to the death of many individuals during COVID. So when we think about health data, we think about even something like the vaccine rollout that happened globally, and some communities being impacted in very real ways. Urban and rural communities not getting the kind of access to the vaccines as, of course, wealthier communities. So when we're thinking about data, we know the possibility is grand. We know the possibility is extraordinary. We know the possibilities are beyond our imagination, because many of us are yet to really, truly imagine what we can do with this technology. But there are concerns, there are risks, and there are dangers that we need to speak about. We also speak about prosperity. We know when we think about our sustainable development goals, when we think about the development of our countries, when we think about the fact that data is now being used to answer some of the world's most challenging questions around climate, around food security, around industry, around biodiversity. We're seeing the spectacular things that we can do with data, the algorithms that we can build, the ways in which we can deploy very bespoke AI to treat with many of these challenges. But where there is prosperity, there are also concerns. Who's prospering? Who's benefiting? Who's getting the profits? When you think about big tech companies and you think about the fact that some of these companies that were designed for very, very basic social engagement now have the ability to determine, define our identities through a digital interface. And when we think about the power that these companies hold, when we hear things like Facebook is now $1 billion company, what did Facebook use to become a $1 billion company? What was Facebook selling? Us. Everything about us. Everything that we shared, our lives, our parties, our recipes, our fashion, our engagements, where we shopped, where we dined, where we went to church, our academic achievements. We were tagging our friends who we had not seen since high school. We were sharing our location, and we were doing these things because we wanted to engage more. We wanted to interact. Some of us may be looking for other ways in which to socialize, not knowing when we first interacted with that technology that our data was being extracted, that our data was being exploited, and that data would now be monetized by someone else, by an agency, and that data would also be sold and shared and traded like a commodity. So when we're thinking about prosperity, we know that data can do some great things, but we've also got to understand that data could do some very bad things. So prosperity for who? Who's benefiting? What are the long-term impacts? What's being taken away from us? What's the trade-off that we are making every time we interact with technology? This extraordinary promise, the promise of collaboration. I am very committed to AI. I'm very committed to the ways in which we could innovate intelligence. I'm very committed to the things that we can do with data, how we can press AI into service, collective imagination, collective intelligence, the ways in which we can augment intelligence. Very, very important. This is the future, and this is where we're going, and I'm definitely a part of that. But where there is that promise, technology has under-delivered. Recent study released a few days ago showed that many companies were not using generative AI, and those companies that were using generative AI have not profited or have not benefited. It shows that the technology has helped us on a personal level, on a social level, has made a lot of us feel more efficient. ChatGPT makes a lot of us feel more creative, more exciting, more intelligent. Now we can whip up a poem in real time. We probably never wrote a poem in our lives, and now we are looking like poets as we are sharing information with friends. We're doing business models, and we are coming up with new business strategies. But where there is that promise for a future, and a very exciting future, you've got to also ask yourself about the power, about the ways in which this technology may be undermining the things that we hold dear. So where there is that promise, there is also this question of how pervasive the technology is. And I always say it, most of us do not know, as we are sitting in this room, an algorithm and many algorithms are making decisions about us. Decisions about who we are, how we think, what we are worth, what type of access we should get, what type of resources we are going to have access to. And it's not making a decision only about us today. It's also making a decision about us that's probably going to last about 5 years. I always say the data has a memory. Data has a memory beyond its computation. Data carries with it a history that carries and carries and carries, given the challenges that we are seeing with historic data sets, particularly in criminal justice. and mortgages and loans and credit scores and education. We are seeing the challenges of historic data. When we think about how pervasive data is, we are there, we are using data, we are using our technology, we are engaging with this technology to make ourselves better, to enhance what we are doing, to reimagine the world that we want to live in. But are we thinking about the interface? Are we thinking about what we look like on the other side of that computer? How many people know what their digital and their data identity looks like? Anyone would like to take a guess? What we look like as data points. And that's something we need to think about, because this technology, data, and algorithms do not allow us to change our minds. When that data is extracted and that data creates a profile, that profile is moving and moving and moving with us. There's the question of agency, the question of autonomy, the question of self-actualization, and the question of self-determination. Those are things that we don't think about, but it's happening every time we click, every time we share, every time we tag. We are giving so much of ourselves, of our person, of our identities through data, not knowing that these data sets, these models that are being designed, as much as they may be able to support the kind of growth we need to see as a collective, they also have the ability to be weaponized against us. And when we think about progress, it's something we hear over and over again. Data is about progress. Data is about development. Data is about attaining those goals that we have set for ourselves and our country, sustainable development goals, and all of these things are real. But at the same time, who is participating in designing this technology? Who is participating in the ways in which the technology is developed and deployed? When we think about data, when we think about AI, we've got to ask ourselves that question about participation, that question about public oversight, that question about who's governing the technology. How much of a voice do we have in the governance of this technology? What about our communities? What about the ways in which we are thinking about community-inspired, data-driven technology, or community-inspired artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence that is being built by the people and for the people, something we call public interest technology? Technology that's being built in the interest of the public. We've got to think about all of this as we are thinking about progress, because we could be moving forward, but going nowhere. We could be moving forward, but moving backward at the same time. We've got to think about progress, but we've got to think about it within the context of how are we profiting from our data, or who is profiting from our data? Who is experiencing the progress? And this is the thing about data. You may be in a country, and you may find in a country, you may not be part of that data set or that community that's become vulnerable or that's being victimized or marginalized. But then as a country, you are now part of a data set that assumes you are the global south, and assumes that nothing important comes from the global south. Because when we speak about data, we speak about data in terms of the global north. We know the 5 biggest companies in the world when it comes to data, and you could name them, exist where? In the United States. We know that China is having a very vigorous move for that title. We know that Africa is trying to think of ways in which they need to decolonize the kind of colonization they are seeing with data and AI in their space. And we know that India is thinking about data governance and data provenance and data localization and how to keep their data within their borders. But we've got to think about that progress. And you've got to ask yourself, who's moving forward? Who is profiting? Where are the communities situated? Very, very important. And the question of privilege. Privilege is a very major question when we think about data justice, because privilege situates who's included and who is excluded. Privilege is about representation. Who is represented in the data sets? We know when it comes to healthcare data, particularly in the United States and in Europe, what we see is a underrepresentation of Black and brown communities. We see an underrepresentation of diversity. We see the lack of inclusion, and we see these challenges undermining equity in healthcare. And what happens? Misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis, communities that are not being diagnosed, communities that are being rejected. So when we think about privilege, we've got to think about that question again about power. And who holds the power decides who is privileged, who is going to be privileged to a particular kind of access or a particular kind of resource, or who is going to have the ability to have a particular kind of dream, a particular kind of future. So we must think about representation. Of course, there's the question of prejudice. And we continue to see that in many of our data sets, particularly when we speak about criminal justice, when we speak about policing, when we speak about profiling, when we speak about data that's being racialized. This is a 2016 case, ProPublica in the US, and this was pivotal in expressing and exploring and pushing into the mainstream the question of machines bias, the question of risk, the question of how do we mitigate the risks that we are seeing in our data sets? How do we detect those risks? How do we mitigate those risks? How do we manage those risks? And how do we take all of that information and enhance the process? And what this shows is data in the United States, in the criminal justice system, historical data that created these risk scores. And in the United States, we have been using algorithms for about 25 years to determine sentencing, to look at questions around public safety, to look at questions around parole. Who leaves the prison system and who stays? And this was very basic. These two juveniles, very misdemeanors, small crimes, petty crime. This young man was for shoplifting. This young woman picked up a scooter and rode it about 2 blocks past her house, left it there and ran away. And when they went to court, her risk to public safety was 8. His risk was 6. When you look at the violence here and when you look at the violence there, you ask yourself, what was that data thinking? And what that historic data was thinking is that it is carrying a memory of criminal justice that says that certain groups are more criminal than other groups. The data that was being used was data points for bias because they were using the data sets of where they lived, their zip codes, whether their families owned property, whether they had a home phone or a landline, as opposed to these other individuals who may have come from communities in Florida where they actually came from a family that owned property, that owned a home. And when you think about the ways in which data points are used and weaponized against us, we've got to think. And this is about, I'm not pinpointing Facebook, but over the last few years, Facebook is where many of our examples of doing data dangerously have come from. And the ways in which we never knew that those photographs that we were sharing were going to be extracted and were going to be used for targeting in facial recognition and other types of technologies. This is also a test case in the US. This gentleman by the name of Robert Williams was at work when his wife called him and said, the police are at the house, they want you, they are here to arrest you, could you please come home immediately? He's driving home from work and he's thinking it's a prank. He's saying this has to be a joke, what are you talking about? She said, the police are here. They have photographs of you shoplifting watches at a high-end store in a mall in Detroit. The man is clueless. He really thinks this isn't happening. He gets to his home, he's arrested in front of his children, and of course he's taken to the police station, the police precinct, and he stays there for about 15 hours until one of the police officers decided to look at his driver's license and compare it to the images from facial recognition and CCTV and realize this is not the man. In the meantime, he lost his job, had to secure a lawyer. Well, actually, the American Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Union took up the case. It took a few years. He eventually got $250,000, but this became the test case for facial recognition and policing. And of course, the Detroit police had to go back, think about questions around data ethics, remove facial recognition technology from the ways in which they were using it, and really think about data ethics and data justice and the ways in which we're thinking. And when we think about policing and the things that we are doing now with algorithmic policing, we're seeing the EU's AI Act that does an exceptional job in really highlighting the levels of risk, says we do not need algorithms in policing. We do not need to deploy algorithms against migrants. We do not need to deploy algorithms in spaces where we can have social services as opposed to police services. We need to really rethink how we're doing that. And the question here is, are we creating new stories with technology? Or are we creating new technology to perpetrate old stereotypes? And it's something that we need to think about. And really, this just is an example of what was happening with Clearview and a very similar case here in Brazil. The question of democracy, very important to data justice. When we think about democracy, we're also thinking about our rights, about data rights. But when we think about democracy and data, we're also thinking about disinformation, distrust, the ways in which we are now accessing information, the fact that many of us believe that the information that we're accessing is real time, is the information that we want. But what we're seeing in democracy is really the weaponization of data. And this is one of the biggest cases, Cambridge Analytica, and what Cambridge Analytica did in several countries. And we saw it, you experienced it in 2018, it made big news here. We know that in 2016, the US spoke about it extensively as well, and the ways in which data can do an extraordinary good job for democracy, but it can also undermine our democracy. And then there's this question of data and pain, which is very, very dear to me, and it's something that we don't think about. And it's something that I really introduced into sort of the lexicon of data science, and it's called data trauma. And many individuals have experienced data trauma, and it's really the psychological, emotional, and social harm caused when data, rooted in histories of oppression, surveillance, and systemic bias, is misused, weaponized, stripped of context, leading to the re-traumatization of individuals and communities across generations, intergenerationally. So when we talk about erasure and extraction and exploitation of data, we're talking about the fact that different communities have historically experienced data differently. And it's very, very real. So data trauma occurs when people are reduced to data points, denied agency over our digital identities, or harmed by data-driven or algorithmic decision-making systems that echo past injustices. Data trauma is just not technical. Its effects ripple through memory, identity, and trust. And these are big questions for communities, because what we continue to see with data is bias, discrimination, marginalization, profiling, victimization. These are all very, very real when we think about data trauma. And of course, we've got to think about these data-driven decision-making systems that we continue to use. And the fact that many of these systems are uneven in the ways in which they deal with racial, economic disparities, this question about marginalization, and as well this question of systemic racism. These are real, very, very real. So as we finish up this presentation, data is about people. Data is about personhood. Data is about who we are. We need data. We need data for everything that we are doing if we are existing in the world today. I love data. I spend a lot of time with data. I spend a lot of time thinking about data, a lot of time helping people use their data more efficiently. I do a lot of work in forecasting, looking at insight and bringing that oversight when it comes to the ways in which we are thinking about data. But we've also got to think about people. And are we using data as a form of liberation, as a form of us truly getting to explore who we are, as a form of us truly getting to engage with the world in which we need to engage? Are we having equity in our engagements? Are we having equity in our access? Are we having equity when it comes to the resources that we are getting? And it's a very, very real question. And this is where protection comes in. Data governance, compliance when it comes to companies, when it comes to enforcement and ensuring that the laws that we have in place are swift, are certain, are severe to deal with individuals who undermine our human rights and our civil rights and our dignity. Data is a question of dignity. Data is a question of respect. And this is why it needs to be protected. We knew the EU, GDPR, set the standard. We know the EU now has its EU's AI Act. And we also know that there's something very spectacular that comes out of Brazil when it comes to the conversation about data and data governance, and of course, questions around equity and inclusion and diversity, and how do we protect data, how do we protect our citizens, and how do we build with data, but build with the due diligence, build with an understanding of due process, fairness, and justice, and build with an understanding of duty of care and ethics of care, understanding those questions of dignity and those questions of personhood. And of course, always being ethically vigilant when we are using data. And it comes back to public education. It comes back to public information, because good public education and good public information makes even better public oversight, which is critical to data governance, which is critical to data justice, which is critical to equity. And equity is about competitiveness. Equity is about ensuring we all have access, we all get a piece of the pie. And when we think about our future, we know that data is being used to build algorithms. We know algorithms is being used to build AI, and we know that AI is the future. We're talking about superintelligence. But we also know that data and algorithms and AI are socio-technical instruments, because they really rearrange our social relationships, and we're seeing that. And it's really informing the future of society. And what it's calling for is interdisciplinary thinking. What do we need to do when it comes to data governance and data justice? We need to have what I call an interdisciplinary imagination. So as a critical data scientist and a data science professor, we see in particular that data must intersect with sociology and criminology and history and every otherology that there is out there for us to get the best results. Data is not standalone. I always say, I'm a criminologist and criminal psychologist, and I always say to my students, you interrogate data long enough, and it's going to confess to anything you want it to confess to. That's data. But you have got to understand the power of data. You've got to understand how powerful it is and the fact that it is pushing our future forward. But you've also got to understand it needs an interdisciplinary approach to get the best out of it. It needs that interdisciplinary imagination to ensure we are doing what we need to do with it for social good, for the future of good. We are bringing that ethical vigilance into the space, because it all comes down to legacies. What is the legacy that you want to build using data? And the funny thing is this, with data, we're seeing questions around ageism, and with data, we're seeing children being born, and their future already exists in the data that defines their families, their communities, their countries. And we are seeing now that we are even dreaming in data. But for many countries in the global south, our data infrastructure is not even owned by us. Those cables, those clouds. So we could be dreaming in a country, and our dream is now owned by someone else. And the big question is, what is the legacy you want to leave with your use of data? What is the narrative and the story you want to tell with your data? When we are long gone from here, and you may know that a very big topic right now in data is the question of data in the afterlife. What happens to our data when we die? And it's something that scholars are thinking about. It's something, of course, lawyers are thinking about. Do we bequeath it to someone? Do we leave our data to someone? Does someone have access to our data when we're long gone? Are people using our data to make decisions that may be weaponized against our own family, our own children, or our grandchildren, the grandchildren we never know we had, sort of grandchildren? We've got to think about how that data is being used. And why I think about all of this and what I will say is just a few things. If you're using data, these are the things, I'm going to end right here, that you need to think about always. Of course, you need to think about the risks. Of course, you need to think about detecting, mitigating, and managing those risks, and of course, improving your systems. But you've got to always think about accountability, transparency, explainability, fairness, questions around accuracy, questions around auditability. How are we auditing the data that we're using? How are we auditing the algorithms that we're using? What kind of impact assessments are we using? What sort of stress testing and red teaming are we doing to ensure that our algorithms are not going rogue, or that our data is now sort of flaccid and doesn't have the kind of punch that it needs? You've got to think about all of that. You've got to ensure that the work that you're doing with data is non-discriminatory and it's not biased. Because when we think about data and we think about AI, and I'll say it one final time, there is no AI without data. You need data. Data is the lifeblood of everything we're doing in AI. And the reason we need to think about data within the concept of justice, and the reason we need to think so strategically about data, because it's not only about us. I always say data ethics is not only about us. It is critical about us and to who we are. It's also even more important to those we have never met and those we are going to leave behind. And with that, I thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, Renée.
Thank you very much,
This is the
Renée.
part where I always get confused because I don't know what she's saying.
Thank you very much, Renée. Bom, depois de uma palestra fantástica,
Well, after that
como essa,
fantastic talk,
gostaria de encaminhar, fazer algumas perguntas
I'd like
breves
to ask
à
some
Renée,
brief
introdutórias.
questions, introductory
Segundo
questions for
momento, abrir o
Renée,
microfone
and then
para as
afterwards
perguntas do público,
we'll
tanto
open up
presente
for
quanto
questions from the
online.
audience
Mas antes de
that are
fazer
here
essas
in
perguntas, só
person
para fazer
and
uma
online.
pequena conjuntura com o nosso seminário dessa palestra,
Just
a
a
Renée
couple of
falou sobre as
comments.
possibilidades
So Renée talked
e o
about the
equilíbrio
possibilities
com o
and the
desenvolvimento de
balance
novas tecnologias e o
with the
processo
development of
regulatório.
new technologies
Ela
and the
falou
regulatory
sobre
process.
questões
She talked
controversas de
about
prosperidade.
controversial
A Renée
aspects in
falou
terms of
sobre a
prosperity. She talked
pervasividade ou a
about the
possibilidade de usos pervasivos de
pervasiveness
dados.
or the
E algo que ela
pervasive
trouxe
use of
e
data.
vi para mim que é uma das
And
maiores
another thing that she
contribuições que
mentioned,
nós
which I
podemos
believe is
trazer
one
para
of the biggest
pensar
contributions
proteção de
that
dados
we have,
pessoais e
is
principalmente falando
protection of
pouco da
personal
minha área,
data,
a
and
sua
especially in
conversa com o
my
direito
area,
civil brasileiro,
that how
que
that
é
relates to
a
civil
sua
rights
tese
in
de data
Brazil
trauma,
and
trauma,
about
né, movido por
data
dados,
trauma.
que afeta três
So
elementos
that
essenciais,
affects
né?
three essential
Memória,
elements: memory,
identidade e
identity,
confiança.
and
E eu
trust.
não poderia me furtar de não casar
So
pouco essa fala
I
da Renée
really have
dentro, por
to
isso que eu
match what
acredito que
Renée said Because
interdisciplinaridade
that's why I
enriquece
believe that
tanto as nossas
interdisciplinarity really
respostas para os problemas
enriches
que não são
our
tão comuns
answers to
e às
the
vezes
problems that aren't
nós nem
that
nos damos
common, but
conta.
sometimes we
Nós
don't
temos
even
aqui, Renée, uma
realize that.
professora,
Renee, we
que é a
have
Caitlin, está aqui à
a
frente,
professor here with
e
us,
ela tem
Caitlin,
trazido também
and
questões, aspectos de
she's been
responsabilidade
talking
civil
about
para o
civil
campo das novas tecnologias.
liability
E para
for
isso, ela
new
tem escrito trabalhos que
technologies.
têm
So she's been writing papers
conjugado dois instrumentos,
that
né?
have
O dano
connected two
injusto
instruments,
e o princípio da
unfair
solidariedade
damage and the
social. Quando
principle
nós vemos
of
os
social
impactos dos
solidarity.
dados a
So
partir de uma
when we
tese
see the
construída
impact
como a
of
sua,
data
eu vejo como isso pode
based on the
enriquecer
thesis
para
that
o
you
campo dos
built, I can
direitos
see how that
digitais,
can
para
enrich
as nossas
in
construções
the
teóricas de
digital
ampliação
fields
do
area
conceito de
and
solidariedade
the
social, de
expansion in the
resposta e de
concept of
responsabilidade
social
para aspectos de
solidarity
accountability,
and
transparência,
liability,
prestação
accountability,
de contas. E
transparency.
aqui no Brasil,
So
é
here
o que
in
vocês
Brazil,
chamam de liability, né?
you call
Vocês
it
têm duas
liability.
palavras para
So you
falar
have
sobre
two
o que nós
words
entendemos
in
como
English.
responsabilidade, né?
We
Que é
have one word,
liability e
responsibility in Portuguese.
responsibility.
And
E
English, you can
aqui
say
nós usamos
liability
tudo
and
como uma palavra
responsibility.
só.
But
E eu
for us,
acredito
it's
que isso
all
ajuda muito a enriquecer
responsibility.
esse
So
cenário.
that
Então, te
really helps to
agradecer
enrich in that
profundamente
scenario. So I
sobre
would
as
deeply
suas
like to thank you
trazimento de questionamentos. Tenho certeza que os seus
for everything
incômodos são os
you
mesmos
say. I believe
dos
that
nossos.
what
Então, para isso, eu queria já
bothers you is
iniciar
also
fazendo
very
uma primeira
bothersome to
pergunta
us
e te
as
ouvir
well. So
mais
I'd
uma
like to
vez um
start off
pouco
with the first
mais
question and listen to you a
sobre
little bit more.
processos
So about
antidiscriminatórios no uso de tecnologia, já
anti-discriminatory
que o nosso painel é
processes in
sobre
using
justiciabilidade.
technology, as we're talking
Eu
about
queria
data
entender
justice, I'd
como é
like
que
to
pode fazer essas
understand
ações
how
concretas
can we have
para
concrete
grupos
actions
vulnerabilizados como um todo,
for more vulnerable
pessoas
groups
negras e
overall?
indígenas,
So Blacks,
comunidade
Native
LGBTQIAP+,
Indians,
aspectos
LGBTQ
relacionados
plus
a grupos vulneráveis em
communities,
geral, né? Podemos
vulnerable
incluir
groups in general, where
idosos,
we can include the
crianças,
elderly,
mulheres,
children,
né? Então, eu vou
women.
fazer a pergunta em inglês,
So
mas
I'll ask
especificamente
the
sobre o
question in
processo
English, but
de biometrias,
specifically about
para compartilhar
biometric
contigo notas
processes to
interessantes.
share with you
Hoje,
something
no Brasil,
interesting.
para
In
recebermos
Brazil today,
benefícios
in
sociais
order
do
to
governo,
receive a
a
social benefit
biometria
from
foi
the government,
estabelecida por lei
biometrics
em
was established by
obrigatoriedade
law.
para os
So it's
nossos grupos
mandatory
vulneráveis,
for
que são
our
majoritariamente
vulnerable
pessoas negras
groups.
no nosso
And
país.
in most part, they
Eu
are
queria te fazer
Blacks
essa
in our
pergunta que eu vou
country.
fazer em
So
inglês, mas só
I'm
para
going to
trazer o
ask you a
contexto para
question
as
in English, but
pessoas.
just giving everybody
How
else the
can we
context.
consider anti-discrimination actions for vulnerable groups from the perspective of data justice applied to the processing of biometric data for public safety purposes, investigations, and criminal decisions? And we can add actually as well for social benefits as well, if you want to address a little bit more. Thank you so much.
Sure, a fantastic question. And I will begin my answer saying that the first thing we need to do is reimagine the meaning of vulnerable. And I mentioned it a bit in the presentation. So we think about vulnerable groups often would be groups, let's say Black and brown communities in the States, or maybe Afro communities here, indigenous communities. But you also remember is that you may not be in a vulnerable group in Brazil, but now when your data is dealt with externally, you become a vulnerable group because we know what the world thinks about data from the global south. The world believes that global south data is not data of real importance. The data that they want is that Western, sort of American, European data. So immediately you're in a vulnerable group. And as we move through life, we become members of vulnerable groups. So we may be young today, we are old tomorrow, and then we are facing ageism because of those algorithms. So vulnerability is a word that oftentimes used with a lot of safety when we think about who is vulnerable or who's not vulnerable. What AI is teaching us is that we are all vulnerable. Each and every one of us in this room, our data is being used for things we have never imagined. Our data is being traded, it is being sold at the moment like a commodity. Many of us may not even know that our data could be enslaved at this moment, doing things that we never expected it to do. That's when we think about data. That's when we think about the work of data brokers and these data cartels. The criminal justice system is now creating profiles for these companies that scrape the internet, that steal data, profiles that are very similar to terrorist organizations, through gangs, through illicit organizations, and that should make you think. Now, when it comes to biometrics, we've got to put a stop on that. Biometrics sounds easy, right? It's an easy, we can use our face, we could use our hand, we could use our eyes. But we've also got to think about these things. If I came to you and I said, my dear, you look so spectacular, could I borrow your eyes? Are you going to give me those eyes? No, you're not, right? But that's your biometrics, right? That's your data. If I said to you tonight, I want to do something illicit, can I just use your fingerprints for 10 minutes? What are you going to say to me? Lady, you're crazy. What is wrong with you, right? Exactly. So when we think about data, we've got to break it down. And I know it sounds funny, but the thing is, it's funny until it's sad. Your data is an extension of who you are. Your data is an extension of your personhood. We have been using technology for so long, and we have been giving. Our data is the gift that never stops giving, because every day we are using technology, every day we are giving of ourselves. And if someone was to bring you a readout of your data for the last 15 or 20 years of your engagement with technology, we would be afraid of ourselves. We use the internet, we use Google, we use ChatGPT to often ask the most intimate questions about ourselves, our families, each other, our health, our financial situation, our education, the things that make us concerned about who we are, the things that make us afraid of this world, the things that concern us about our children, the things that we may see that we don't understand. The first thing that we do is we go to technology, oftentimes privately, to get an answer. Think about all the private and the intimate things you have shared in the space of data. And it comes back to that question of biometrics. And what we're seeing with biometrics is that biometrics can do some great things. And we know in financial services, it really works good with fraud detection. The fact that we're seeing it work in healthcare when it comes to pain management, and patients who are having strokes and heart attacks are able to use their phone and their biometric, and we're seeing real exceptional research when it comes to precision. But then there's the other side, the sad side, where we know that biometrics are used to track, to trace, to terrorize, to traumatize communities and groups. And what that biometrics also does, it undermines people's legacies, because what you're doing is you're creating a profile that's not going to change. You're creating a profile that denies access, denies resources, and you're saying who's included in certain things and who are going to be excluded. So with everything that we're seeing with data, there is the reward and there's the risk. And it comes to how strategic and oftentimes how creative, how imaginative are we when it comes to balancing the reward and that risk, but always understanding that there are rights. And we have a responsibility to each other to ensure we uphold what is the best of this technology and match it to the best of humanity.
Thank you, Renée. Eu queria abrir o espaço do microfone para perguntas.
I'd now like to open the floor for questions. Whoever wants to ask questions, we will now listen to you. And both people here in the auditorium and those questions online too. We have some people who've already asked to use the mic, so I'll open the floor for you to ask your questions as we're getting close to the end of our time here. Please say your names before you ask your questions, where you're from, and then you ask your questions to Renée. We'll have 2 face-to-face questions and 1 online question later on. Okay, so please feel free.
Everybody. My name is Marcos from Coelho Lima Law Firm. Ms. Cummings, I would like to thank you for your knowledge to share with us. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask in Portuguese, I think is better. Nós temos aqui no Brasil a filósofa Marilena Chauí, da
we
qual ela
have
fala sobre
a philosopher, Marilena Chauí, and she talks about a change in subjectivity caused by social media. So the use of social media has led to a change in leading to narcissistic behavior, and every narcissist is also depressed, and this is caused by a dependence, that you depend or rely on the gaze of the other. When you talk about diffusion of data, you're saying that big data, they're not authorized to change our mind because of the amount of data we share with them all the time, every day. Can you expand on that? Thank you.
Maravilha, muito obrigada.
Thank you. Wonderful. Now, the other question.
An honor to hear you. Thank you for a very insightful and also inspiring speech. We saw notes frantically being taken over the audience. I think that's the best sound of what we have done here. I'm Claudio Lucena. I'm a professor at Paraíba State University and also sitting currently at the National Data Protection Council in Brazil. I used to say to my students that we used to talk about data that we have, while now the right approach is to talk about data that we are. So I think this changes the game. I want to ask you about one dimension that was not explicitly taken in your presentation, which is the dimension of time. Byung-Chul Han says that democracy does not fit in the time frame that we're building in the digital society. It needs reflection, it needs time, it needs maturing, and we do not have this time in the data economy that we have created today. And a second question, I'm coming from an underserved region in Brazil, so there is an asymmetry within the country of how we deal with data governance, data structures, and data solutions. So I think it's not a very different scenario from the United States. Digital inclusion metrics and indicators are different in California than they are in Wyoming. So when you think about solutions for the issues you have brought, how do you see them spanning across regional asymmetries like there is in the United States? Thank you very much again.
Obrigada, Cláudio. Vou passar a palavra à Renée para que ela
Thank you,
possa
Claudio.
fazer
I'll give the
as
floor to Renée for her to give her answers.
Fantastic. Two absolutely fantastic questions. I'll speak about the narcissist question first, and you are quite correct when you espoused that perspective and the kind of fascination with self that this technology is creating. There are several scholarly works that look at the question of particularly data and algorithms and AI and social media creating an extraordinary amount of anxiety, this thing called the anxiety generation, and how people are dealing with it or how young people are not dealing with. And for a very long part of my life, I often move between the sociology and the psychology. So a very good time of my life, I was in private practice as a psychologist, and I still do work in that realm, and you're quite correct. Because now when we're looking at the notes that psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists keep, there's one person that keeps coming up in all of that question, and that's, social media. Social media has impacted people in a way that has never been imagined. When we think about identity, when we think about self-identity, when we think about how young people are thinking about themselves or not thinking about themselves. And I will say this to you, 10 and 20 years ago, for someone who was in college, just getting an A was sufficient for you to feel accomplished. I continue to meet young people who are getting A grades and they're not looking happy. And when I say, what's going on with you, it's like, I don't have 100,000 followers, right? So the world has changed. We forsake something like an A grade for likes or for being an influencer, whatever that means at the moment. And it's also a very critical question to this whole idea of this narcissistic thing that we're becoming, and that subjective approach that has been changed. So when we think about data, we know there's nothing neutral about data. Data is being used in every facet to tell a story and to get a reaction from you. So when we think about social media, we know what those algorithms are doing. We know those companies know what those algorithms are doing. And we know those companies allow those algorithms to toe the line and to push the envelope and to go in places because they are continuously extracting that data. Because the thing about AI is this, and if there's one thing that's constant about AI is that the developers, the designers, the deployers, all of us, do not truly understand the capacity of this technology. And it comes back to the GPTs and the hallucinations and why it is the data is doing things that even the computer scientists and data scientists do not understand why the models are behaving. So the thing about your question is that it's so brilliant, it doesn't have an answer, because we are now living the answer. So maybe in about 10 years, the researchers and the scientists and the social scientists will give us the answer to your question, because in truth and in fact, we're the experiment, we're the research. When it comes to, Professor, your question about democracy, you're quite correct. When I speak, I spoke about it, I speak about real-time governance. And there could be another word for that, but it's a family event, so I'm not going to use that word, right? Because you just said it. It's about the fact that governance is not happening in the time, democracy is not happening in the time that it's supposed to happen. We know that the law is always behind the technology. We know the technology is designed in ways in which it creates these extraordinary loopholes and drops these veils and these blinds. It's like when we're accessing a new app, right? We click and we click and we click and we click to the end. I accept, I accept, I accept, I accept, I accept. Okay, you would think it was a series of marriage proposals. It was not, but we go through this thing and we accept everything, and when we accept it, we do not have a clue what was said. There was a research study that was done, and I think the study, do not quote me, the study said, for us to truly read the user agreement on our phone, it will probably take us about 3 months. So the fact of the matter is the companies know that none of us is taking the time to read that. And it doesn't, when we use all these different apps, we're not thinking about that. And you're quite correct. How do we respond to something that's moving so quickly? Democracy is really no test for the speed and the scale of this technology. But what do? We can't throw our hands up in exhaustion. We can't stand wringing our hands, looking as though, we don't know what to do. We've got to do something. And I think we're doing it. We're doing it with our laws. We're doing it with the use cases that keep happening that helps us to fortify and improve those laws. But we've also got to do it with the conversations, the gatherings like these, individuals like yourselves, having more and more of these conversations. But I always say these conversations cannot stay in these rooms. We've got to move them out into the spaces where people need to truly understand that it's about civil rights. It's about your civil liberties. It's about human rights. It's about dignity. It's about respect, as you will not allow someone to come and extract a piece of your flesh, a piece of your, or just drain your blood while you're having a conversation with them. That's exactly what we're doing with data. It's like we're on our phones, we're on our computers, and we're giving our data. And it's like someone is just there draining. It sounds very vampire-ish, I'm sorry. But you get the idea. So it's something we need to think about, and you're quite correct when we think about data. The other question about data is the data that's been collected, that we do not even know what's been collected and what these companies have. And from what I have heard and what I have read, many of these big companies are only using about 20% or less of the data they've actually collected. So what are they doing what has been amassed? We may not be even here to figure that out. So a brilliant question. Thank you.
Thank you, Renée. Eu vou abrir para mais uma pergunta do público, então, por conta do avançar da hora.
We will have another question from the audience, and then we will have the final remarks and the closing of the session.
I have two questions. The first, em quem a senhora votou para presidente dos Estados Unidos?
Who did you vote for, Kamala or Donald? That's one question. Now, the second question is, And why? Sorry, in the second question, we live in a world that's dominated by social media. I worked in market research for 25 years. So I know that data is really tampered with. I saw this. And the current US president uses data in the wrong way. Like yesterday, the director of the Fed was dismissed because she didn't use data, so that data was tampered with in order to fire her. He uses data in his social media platform as well. And people don't like reading or going deeper into things. They just believe it. Whatever he says, they believe it. Not only the right, but also the leftist parties and other groups use manipulated data. So how can lay people, I mean, how can lay people or people from all what should we do to avoid this, to stop believing whatever they're saying, every character? Thank you.
Oh, that first question, absolutely brilliant, right? Who did I vote for? I'm going to meet you after and I'm going to whisper it in your ear and you're going to tell me whether or not. Or maybe I can vote for you. I vote for you. I vote for you. And that question about data, is this. We have constantly got to interrogate data. There is nothing neutral about data. Many people believe because it's data, it's scientific, it's mathematical, it's statistical, but it still is not objective. I always say there is nothing called raw data. All data has been cooked in one way or another. That's why data carries with it this memory. Data's computational memory and data's cultural memory do not come together. So when it comes to how do we do that, it goes back to data literacy. It goes back to data literacy and the fact that questions such as data ethics, data justice, data rights, civil rights, human rights, need to now be at the earliest level of our schooling. Some of us have the luxury, they say there are two educations, the one that you get from, the establishment, and the ones that you get from other, and the ones that you give yourself. And this is a moment that calls for three educations, right? The one that you get in your school, the formal one, the one that you give yourself, and the one that you need now to exist in this world of disinformation, distrust, deep fakes, but yet data is something so beautiful, something just so spectacular that we can do an extraordinary amount of good with this technology. If we are to reimagine this technology in a way in which we uphold dignity, in a way in which we respect rights, in a way in which we reimagine that respectful engagement, and in a way in which we think about everything that I want for myself, I want for you, and I want for you and every community. And I keep saying data and algorithms are about legacies, and that's what they do. They're creating a legacy, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, are we part of that? Are we part of the good, or are we part of the bad? And that's the sort of ambiguity and ambivalence of the technology as well. So it really comes down to data literacy, and I will continuously promote this area called public interest technology. We have got to bring the voice of the people into it. And that's the only way we can equalize the power structure called data.
Obrigada, Renée. Bom, estamos nos encaminhando para o final.
Thank you, Renée. We're reaching the end. So now I would like to thank Renée for your answers, for your brilliant talk, for your presence here with us today. I believe that it was an inspiring moment. And as you're the last keynote, we're ending on a great note and with the proposal for a seminar to make us think in a multidisciplinary manner in how we should move forward with things related to data privacy and protection, understanding concepts that are still being built data justice, the things related to discriminatory bias, response from our officials, such as our data privacy officials, in terms of things that are still a bit cloudy, such as biometrics. We recently had a public consultation promoted by the industry so that the population, like you mentioned, can contribute, even technically, so that our officials can design guidelines about good use, ethic use of biometrics. That's just an example of how much we can and must design democratic options so we actually understand what we're talking about when we're talking about data justice. So I would like to thank you and reinforce what Renée has brought to us, that there is memory in the use of personal data. There is no AI without using data. So the layers to protect data and the contours for data protection are essential so we can design the futures that we wish for with the new technologies without reproducing the former logics of repression dressed in these new tools. So thank you once again, Renée, for your brilliant talk. I would like to thank everyone who was present. And as the moderator, our participation has ended in our panel. Renée, would you like to make any final comments? Please feel free.
My final comment would be thank you so very much. And Bianca, thank you very much to you. When we met in Miami at the Black Data Matter conference, Bianca said to me she was bringing me back to Brazil, and I'm here, and I just want to say that she is brilliant, but most of all, she's a woman of integrity. And I respect that, and I honor you. And Brazil should be very proud to have your kind of brilliance. You go, girl.
Renée, Bianca, thank you so much for this powerful keynote. I'd just like to invite you both for a photo. E para o resto do pessoal, vamos começar o nosso intervalo de almoço agora.
For the rest of you now, we start our break for lunch. We have some options here at the event. Please be back at 1:30 Brazil time for Regulatory Sandbox AI. Thank you.